Following is a conversation with Samuel Goldman. Goldman is an associate professor of political science at George Washington University, where he is also executive director of the John L. Loeb Jr. Institute for Religious Freedom and director of the Politics and Values program. His most recent book, After Nationalism, Being American in the Divided Age, was published by University of Pennsylvania Press in spring of 2021. Goldman received his Ph.D. from Harvard and taught at Harvard as well as Princeton before coming to George Washington. In addition to academic work, his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. If you enjoy the conversation and enjoy the content, I please ask you to rate and subscribe to the show, as well as follow on Instagram at Overcoming the Divide, and make sure to check out Sam's book, After Nationalism, Being American in the Divided Age. Thank you. Welcome to the show, Sam. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
Could you tell me a little about yourself, where you're from, a few of your interests, and what your current studies are?
Well, I am an associate professor of political science at the George Washington University, where I have two administrative roles. One as director of the Politics and Values program, which is a freshman honors program for students interested in the study of politics. I'm also executive director of the Loeb Institute for Religious Freedom. Before coming to GW, I taught at Princeton and briefly at Harvard, where I also earned my PhD. And before that, I grew up in northern New Jersey, in Montclair, which some of your audiences may know. As far as extracurricular interests, anyone who follows me on Twitter knows that most of my content these days is limited to questions of menswear and punk rock, which are maybe incongruous interests given the rest of my career, but I think are subjects appropriate for Twitter, which doesn't really flourish as a serious medium.
Well, I appreciate the insight there. But a question I had after looking at your books, the one being After Nationalism, is the identity crisis we're kind of seeing as a nation at this moment. And that kind of got me thinking, for that lack of national identity, is, do you believe America is the sick man of the West as the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe in a certain regard?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I'll answer indirectly by saying that I think the most important question in the study of politics is compared to what? So whenever you're making any assessment of the success or failure of any institution or community or movement or enterprise, you always have to ask, well, compared to what? Is it a success or a failure? So in order to answer your question about whether the United States is the sick man of the West, we have to say compared to what? And that means looking at some of our national and multinational peers. And I'm pleased to say, actually, that compared to the real world alternatives, I think the United States is doing fairly well. We certainly have our problems, some of which I discuss in the book, others of which may come up in our conversation. But I don't think we are doing worse on the whole than Russia, which of course is embroiled in a disastrous war, or China, which has tried to uphold a rigorous zero COVID policy that's now falling apart, and there seems to be an impending public health disaster because the population is not properly vaccinated and hasn't acquired any natural immunity. So they're not doing so well. And the European Union isn't doing so very well. It seems to be deadlocked on issues including Russia and the relation of the national components to the multinational institutions. So again, when you sort of survey the real world and the other large states, not all of which are classical nation states, to which the U.S. can be compared, I think we are in reasonably good shape, even if that's not a justification for complacency. It's just that other people seem to be doing even worse than we are. Not that we are succeeding in such spectacular fashion.
Appreciate it. And that kind of follows in well to my next question, which is, what does it mean to be American in an age of division? I asked national identity crisis because I feel, maybe ignorantly so, but I feel if you have someone in France, what it feels to, or what it is to be French, they could give a, and this could be rooted in ignorance, but I feel they could give a better answer than what it could be to ask an American that same question. And that's because there's no cohesiveness. There's not a one or the other. We don't, our values, or say at, at test, they're being pointed out that they could be rooted in, say, deeply flawed things. You have the
Mm-hmm.
1619 Project that has said that America was founded pretty much in evil and slavery. So how do you contend with that?
Right. Well, I think that the issue is less that American culture is thin or incoherent than that it's pluralistic. And what I mean by that is that different people will give different answers to that question. So for many Americans, the answer, what does it mean to be American, will have what I call in the book a creedal quality. It will have something to do with American political institutions and maybe the moral and philosophical principles that are thought to support them. And that's one way of understanding what it means to be American. For other Americans, it's less to do with politics than with the quality of ordinary life. And these people might talk about economic opportunity or popular culture, and that really defines what it means to be American for them. And for yet another group, um, being American really means being native born, speaking English as a native language, and probably being Christian. Surveys suggest that something like a fifth to a quarter of the population hold roughly that view. So each of those views is internally coherent and is meaningful to large numbers of people. It's just that we give quite different answers, and that's the condition that I try to diagnose in the book. I think the American predicament has to do with disagreement more than thinness or emptiness or the absence of national identity.
Interesting. But what if those things are at complete odds? So more than just a disagreement about certain issues or how we should approach things, more so pertaining to the actual root of the country and whether to be proud or not. So I ask you if you're American, some people today won't be proud in that.
Right,
They'll be make facetious jokes, be like, I'm not in hell, I'm just in America.
right,
Obviously it's the exaggeration, but you get where I'm going.
right. Well, first of all, I think that view is less widespread than it sometimes appears. And there are survey data on these questions that show that majorities of Americans are proud to be American and do honor American history, even though they're also aware of some of the ugly parts of that history. Now, it's true that majority has been dwindling over the last few decades. And it's true that it's polarized in certain ways. So Republicans are more likely than Democrats to express this kind of pride. Older people are more likely than younger people to express this kind of pride. But even so, there is a fairly broad and enduring patriotic consensus, for lack of a better word.
Hmm.
What I think you're pointing to correctly, though, is the increasingly critical tone um, that academic and more generally what people call elite discussions have taken over the last 5 to 10 years. This is what you might hear around a college campus or the pages of the New York Times or another prestige newspaper. And I think that's true. There clearly has been a change, but I think it is more recent and could be more temporary than we expect. If you step back from the day to day developments of politics, which of course are riveting, especially for social media addicts like me, it becomes clear that right through the Obama administration, the dominant mood in many of these circles was a sort of center left liberal patriotism, particularly in Obama's first term, but even in his second term, and that's reflected in works of art like Hamilton, which is clearly a celebration of at least some aspects of the American past. That changed when Trump was elected, and changed maybe even more dramatically in the spring of 2020 in association with the George Floyd protests. But that can change again, and I've noticed even since Biden was elected, and particularly since the congressional elections in November, when Democrats did much better than anybody expected them to do, some shift. So I know what you're talking about, and I agree that it's real. But I think that at least some of it, and maybe more than is immediately obvious, is sort of partisan sour grapes. And
Hmm.
by the way, I should say that you can observe the same phenomena among Republicans and conservatives who think things are basically going well, and America is achieving its proper purposes when a Republican's in the White House, and then when a Democrat enters, everything goes to hell.
I think that's a good segue into something as well, which is how, through your research and your studies, have you found a modern unifying cause to this, where Republicans and Democrats, conservatives, liberals, can find some unity in a rallying cause? People oftentimes point to conflict as a opposition, actually, specifically opposition as a great cause to rally around. Most recently in our, say, lifetime, 9/11
Mm-hmm.
was one that President Bush had the highest, say, presidential ring, I think, in modern history during that one time, and things related to that as well. So also when there's an opposition, seems to get Americans rallying around that. But people thought that was going to happen with COVID, but it didn't. So do you see something in the future, something that Americans can contend with together that can bring people together, or do you think there's too much of a difference between our fundamental values between people?
Well, I think that an external challenge or rival helps, but is not a guarantee of greater unity and consensus. And you refer back to 9/11, and I think many people expected and even hoped in ways that are a little bit gross to read now, that finally modern Americans in the 21st century had found a new cause that would unify the country in the way that that World War II had. That didn't happen. Um, Briefly, it's true that George W. Bush had the highest approval of any modern president, but not for so very long,
Mm-hmm.
because of the way he used that support, uh, leading the country into an unnecessary and unsuccessful war. is a good way of squandering that approval. And it's sort of an interesting counterfactual. What might have happened if Bush had resisted his impulse to invade Iraq? But of course, it didn't happen that way. Now, once again, I think there are people who expect, and some who even hope, that rivalry with China could have the same effect. And my own attitude toward that is great caution. So on the one hand, I share the view, which I think is fairly widespread, that China is a long-term threat to American interests, and that the Chinese Communist Party is a despotic institution that is unfit for rule. So to that extent, I agree, but I do worry about seeking conflict
Mm-hmm.
for the sake of domestic unity. That seems to me a very dangerous game, and dangerous not only because it doesn't always work, but also because there is a significant chance of provoking a serious military conflict. And that would be bad. I don't think anyone wants war with China if it can possibly be avoided.
Besides, say, such, you know, maximum conflict, we'll call it, is there something else that you believe that people can rally around that doesn't cause such divisiveness? It seems that every turn and corner, people can't agree or something's poked out for, say, being rooted in this, or actually it's great. So it's either or. There's no middle ground. Do you think people, or do you think there's an issue out there that people can actually rally around? That there will be a consensus? You mentioned China, but you don't want to get to that scale where it would actually take hold in civil discourse or public discourse, because it might, feed the fire and actually get to an extent that, is not desirable by anyone. So is there something else, do you think?
I don't see anything on the immediate horizon. Although, if the last 10 or so years have taught us anything, it should be that no one knows what to expect, and we're all just making guesses, which are wrong more often than they're right. So I don't
Hmm.
claim any special insight here. But my instinct, which I develop at greater length in the book, is that rather than searching for consensus and agreement, it might make more sense for us to learn how to live with disagreement. You think of the image of the hand in the cookie jar, and if you try to grab all the cookies, you can't get your hand out. You're stuck. But if you just take one or two cookies, then you can withdraw them and enjoy them. So too, when it comes to national identity and unity, I think we want to have a very strong and thick consensus, which really means we want everyone to agree with us. Everyone, we would
Hmm.
all be happy if everyone agreed with us, but that's not possible, and I don't think that's ever going to be possible. So to me, it seems more prudent and likely to succeed to think about how we can live with less consensus and identify what are the issues, the policies, the concerns that really do require broader agreement, that can't break down along regional or cultural or other lines.
Do you believe that rhetoric from politicians are the cause for some of Americans' division? Or do you see that politicians and their rhetoric are more of a mirroring of inside of society's temperament at the moment?
I think more the latter. I think that academics and journalists and political commentators tend to emphasize the supply side of politics, which means that we fetishize words and speeches, and we think that if presidents or other political figures said different words, the world would look very different. And I'm pretty skeptical of that. If words were enough, we would have resolved these problems long ago. Because contrary to the expectation of polarization and opposition, it turns out that when you really look at what they say, most presidents, including the last two presidents, Biden and Trump, are pretty similar when they speak in these terms. I wrote a piece for Reason magazine a few years ago comparing Trump and Biden's inaugural addresses, and there are differences, but on the page there are not as many differences as you might think. And that tells me that the issue is not the words that politicians are or aren't saying, but rather the experience of the world by ordinary people. And that's what leads me to this idea that we need to learn to be satisfied with more disagreement and less cohesion, because it's really, really hard to change the conditions that encourage disagreement and pluralism. It's not because of the words we say or the words that we hear. It's because the ways that we live really have changed.
But do you think that these same politicians, and let's expand this a little, politicians, media, influential figures, have a due diligence for their place in society to put society's betterment, say, first, rather than what serves their own interest? Because what I'm hearing and what I also agree on is they're doing this because it feeds what the society wants. It's kind of what Socrates said. What his issue with democracy was that a baker runs for, say, office, and so is a doctor. Baker says, "You elect me, I give you all free cake." Doctor says,
Right.
"Terrible idea. You all get obese." Baker says, "You hear him? He doesn't want to allow me to give you free food." So it's that same point. Do you believe that these people in offices of influence not so have, or more so, excuse me, a duty to reject this partisanship and this divisiveness, even though it may be popular among the masses, but rather put forward what's better in the long term, even if it may come at their own demise? Do you think,
Right.
there should be principles put first rather than one's own self gain?
I think that politicians do think about that more than we outsiders like to believe. There are exceptions, of course, who I think are wholly irresponsible, and if you want, we can talk about them. But I think they're outliers, and
Mm-hmm.
most people who seek and hold office really do want to do the right thing as they see it. There are much easier ways to make money or attract attention than a career in politics. Um, but they also know that it will be hard for them to do any of those things if they lose their seats or lose the offices that they hold. And in order to win those offices in a democracy, as you described, they have to speak to the public in a way that a sufficient number of voters finds appealing. So that's the constant balance for politicians. How they can pursue what I think are genuine public spirited goals in a democracy that requires that they satisfy a particular set of constituents. And again, it's easy to criticize outliers or specific decisions, and often right to do so.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but at the same time, we who are professional critics and don't face this dilemma ourselves also need to remember how truly hard the job of politics is.
For sure. I think that's fair. It's easier to criticize from outside, say the box, than it is to be in it. But simultaneously, it's also there's a reason why those people are in it. And it's as if you think of, well, if you didn't want to perform surgery, you shouldn't become a doctor. So you apply that to politicians. If you didn't want to put society's betterment interest first, then you shouldn't become a politician type thing. And the winning and losing obviously takes precedent. It makes sense. You know, you want to win, you don't want to lose. But simultaneously, if everyone plays into that, then where like do the values just get pushed aside? Do the principles just push aside? And you mentioned that most people in say Congress do want that unifying image. And I would agree with that, tend to agree. That's what they want. But that's not what their actions, I guess, reflect. You know, for example, on the Republican side, when Trump says some has dinner with a complete anti-Semite, you don't hear the Republican Party at large calling Trump out. The only presidential nominee at the moment for the Republican Party saying, you don't hear the Congress calling out Republicans, that is, saying this is terrible, can't be, accepted, full-heartedly rejected. And, there's countless examples of this on the left as well, such as regarding free speech. When the Hunter
Mm-hmm.
Biden laptop story was actively suppressed on Twitter, you don't hear Democrats now coming out and saying that can't happen. That was a complete talk about election interference. That's election interference. So it goes both ways. And I think people might want to do that, but they don't because it doesn't serve their self-interest in the moment.
Well, I would put it this way. On the one hand, I agree with you that it's important that people in public office think about what their principles are and what they are willing to lose their seats, to end their careers over. And there should be something. I think we can agree there should be some point at which a public official would say, "I'm just not going to do that, even if it means that I lose my election."
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, not everything can be a matter of principle.
Mm-hmm.
Partly because it would mean that politicians wouldn't get very far, and sure, they want bigger and more powerful and more honored jobs. That's one of the reasons they're in the business. But also, they can't do anything
Mm-hmm.
for good or ill unless they win election and hold on to onto office. So again, it's very easy for writers, for professors, for critics to say, well, they should just say whatever they think all the time, let the chips fall where they may. For people in that position, and I include myself, there are no consequences. My
Yeah.
job is to share all of my stupid opinions as I'm doing with you. You're kind enough to listen. My job is not to attract voters or to support a party.
Mm-hmm.
And if you really think that this bunch are doing badly and you can do better, then you should try. And I don't mean
Yeah.
only
Mm-hmm.
you, but in general, it's only through political organization, including but not limited to running for office, that different people will enter Congress and the state houses and other positions of power. And you haven't quite asked me, but I'll tell you anyway. I mean, I think one of the real problems in our political culture is how much of the energy has shifted away from electoral politics and into issue advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
Because granted that these issues are important, people have things to say, they care about them, all of that is true. But in some ways, it's much easier than having to balance personal commitment and political interest, self and party, constituency and country in a way that candidates for office and holders of office have to do every day. It's much easier and more satisfying to be pure, whatever that means for you, whether you know for environmentalism or against abortion or any host of other issues. You don't have to deal with that paradox. And that's really what our constitutional order is supposed to help us to do.
Interesting. I see. Yeah, I think that take is pretty observant in society that you see candidates kind of base their platform, their running platform, on certain issues, and then hot topic issues that are favored, say, or contentious, could either or in that sphere they're running in that arena they're running in. But as we take a look on something different, I do want to give you the opportunity to talk more about your book. I am curious to know, say, in Internationalism, it's about the identity crisis as Americans, but you also discuss in the synopsis of it that I read that, nationalism is on the rise in the West due to an utter disregard of the failures of globalization throughout the world since, say, the 90s. Can you speak to what those failures are and how nationalism, fills that void?
Well, so globalization clearly has material and also cultural benefits. And by many measures, not all measures, we are materially better off. We Americans are materially better off. So are Western Europeans and inhabitants of many parts of the world than they were 30 years ago. And further, there are real personal and cultural benefits. I don't know many people who think that airline tickets should be much more expensive or that it should be harder to travel abroad or harder to watch the TV or movies or listen to the music that you happen to like, whether it comes from the United States or Germany or Canada or France or Kenya or anywhere else. Everyone likes the openness and flexibility that globalization provides. But that also comes at a cost. Some of the material benefits have come at the expense of a particular kind of industrial employment, which was not the norm in most places in this country, but was really concentrated in some areas. And the loss of those jobs was socially devastating. It's not just the loss of money, it was the loss of a social network that gave meaning and order to whole regions. That disappeared. That's a serious problem. The expanded range of cultural offerings creates a paradox of choice, as social scientists like to say. You can no longer defer to three networks and five movie studios to supply the cultural content of your life and to be sure that most of your neighbors will be exposed to most of the same things. Now, each of us is choosing for ourselves, or at least, if not entirely for ourselves, in a more individually tailored way. And choosing is hard, and it's also alienating because what you choose may be different to what other people choose. And finally, the movement of people around the world in the form of renewed mass immigration in the United States, and really an unprecedented level of immigration in much of Europe, is genuinely disorienting. At minimum, there are people who look different, who speak different languages, who have different expectations, and however prosperous and law-abiding they are, that can still be an unsettling experience. When it's not that you got on a plane and went to a different place, but rather a different place came to you and you stayed put. And that's the best case. In the worst case, there can be and are problems of unemployment, crime, assimilation, benefits use, and other genuine costs associated with immigration. So the revival of nationalism, I think, is a response to all of these developments and is a way of saying that the world needs stability, it needs barriers, it needs limits, not only in the physical sense of national barriers, but also in cultural senses, because it is too destabilizing, it is too atomizing, it is too risky to be expected to make your own way economically, materially, and culturally, as the set of trends that we call globalization tends to ask us to do. Now, for reasons that I discuss in the book, I don't think that's going to work, or at least it's not going to work in a country like this one, which is so different in scale, and political tradition to the classical nation states of Europe, that I just think the terms are not commensurable. To my friends on the left, I say, we're not going to be Denmark. To my friends on the right, I say, we're not going to be Hungary. It's just not an apples to apples comparison. But I do understand why people feel that there are problems, because these are genuine problems. And I understand also how enraging it is to be told that real problems that people recognize in their own lives don't exist, or are insignificant, or worst of all, that they somehow deserve them because they are being punished for various forms of undeserved privilege.
Your synopsis provide, say, a little insight into that, but that right there provide much more, and I appreciate it. With wrapping up, I do also want to ask you one final question, which is, when thinking about nationalism, people think of fascism almost like immediately, say, especially in the 30s and even before then. Say it could be Japan, could be Italy, could be Germany, could be a bunch of places. But then more recently, people think of America. They might think of Poland, Italy. But how would you go about thinking a nationalism, or how would you advise someone to go think about a nationalism? Because it does have a very, say, a dark connotation to it. And it's not to say something isn't warranted based on history, but it's
Mm-hmm.
more or less, how do you go to understand it where you could contend with it and also start a dialogue with people who are on that side? Because someone gets labeled a fascist, like, oh, you can't talk to them, they're a fascist, they're this, they're that, they're out of bounds type say. But
Right.
how do you go with starting that dialogue when you kind of like meet in the middle? Where it's like, as you said, like not fascism, excuse me, nationalism, as it did or as it may in other countries tick up, won't do the same here. So how, for the sake of say this country, do you start a dialogue with people who feel those problems, or at least, yeah, feel those issues and see them in their daily lives, believe they do? How would you advise going about speaking to them,
Right. Well, so some
or those ideas, not just them,
right.
as they're like a
Well,
very
so some
minority group?
some theorists draw a distinction between nationalism and patriotism,
Hmm.
and it's a problematic distinction in a lot of ways, because what it tends to mean is patriotism good, nationalism bad, and historically this distinction was really articulated during the Second World War, when it was a way of saying what we have in the United States is good, that's patriotism, but nationalism is for the fascists and Nazis and the Japanese, and of course that's bad. So I refer to the distinction with a certain caveat, that it's imperfect and can become self-congratulatory, and isn't always clarifying. All of that said, I think there is a genuine distinction between an understanding of community that is based on political principles and institutions that are subject to voluntary adoption or affirmation, and one that revolves around involuntary, or to social scientists like fancy terms, what they call ascriptive qualities, things you didn't choose and can't change. And it's not a hard and fast distinction. So take language, for example. Language, in one sense, is voluntary. You can learn another language and speak it, but it can never be your native language. And no matter how hard you try, if you learn a language after about 12 or so, you'll never speak it in the way of a native speaker. So your native language, your first language, is something that you really can't choose, and that can influence you in profound ways. But even though it's not a dichotomy, it is a spectrum. And I think that American patriotism, or if you reject the distinction, American nationalism, has been most successful when it has been open and flexible and has emphasized these political and voluntary characteristics. That's not to say that you just have to affirm the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence and you're an American, no matter who you are or where you live. That goes too far in the direction of abstraction and voluntarism. But if you can say the oath of citizenship and mean it, and demonstrate by your conduct that you recognize and affirm our constitutional order and institutions, that's American enough for me. Um, and that's the vision of American identity that I think is most likely to succeed in bringing us together in the really crucial areas,
So bringing,
while minimizing the danger of pushing us apart through very specific and demanding understandings of what American culture is or ought to be.
yeah, so a nice middle ground between the two.
That's
I,
my hope.
yeah, yeah, I'm just thinking out loud. But I appreciate your time today, Sam. You provide a lot of insight into your book and issues that we see every day in society, but are often ignored. So I thank you for your time, and I think the audience would thank you as well if they had the opportunity.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for talking to me.
Of course.